Okay, good morning everyone. It is both an honour to be in such esteemed company at this conference and a pleasure to be able to share some of my work. Before I begin, I'd like to thank in particular Professor David Daniel for his support and friendship for the last 10 years. A big thank you also to the generous support given to me by Professor John Gilmore, also at the University of Oregon. And I must also thank Maria Haldin and others that have helped put this session together. 2 very productive and enjoyable days I've had, so thank you to Maria and team. I sincerely hope that my audience are much more familiar with the likes of sugar and tea and coffee than they are with opium.
Yes, we are.
While sugar is the product most often associated with indentureship, particularly in the Caribbean, opium has a history that is tethered to indentureship from 1838 through until that system ended in 1917. Indentureship and opium overlap as mutually supporting systems in a number of ways, some of which require us to think with a global perspective. In other ways, the associations are seemingly much more close at hand, such as interpersonal relationships. My paper will show how opium and the opium system were bound up with the ships that brought Indian and Chinese indentured labourers to the Caribbean, Mauritius and elsewhere in the world. The paper looks at the production processes and history of opium, along the way identifying where there is a match, a link or association with indentureship. It will examine how the systems overlap geographically and how opium was used to ensure that financially the British Empire could be maintained. Without opium, empire, and by extension, would not have been economically sustainable, at least to a good extent anyway. Up until the late 1800s, opium was seen as having healing properties, and its power to alleviate pain was recognised even in ancient times. From the time of the introduction of tobacco into China in the 16th century, opium was used as a recreational drug. At this stage, it appears to have been the reserve of an indulgent few who had time and money to burn. In the early 1770s, the British East India Company established a monopoly over production. A monopoly over production, over the production of opium in India. The effects of the arrival of the East India Company can be seen in these figures as the rise in production of Indian opium reaches an industrial scale. It took some time for the narcotic to spread to the agents of the Mandarin or to the likes of priests, to women, and then eventually to labourers. So that whole process took a fair amount of time. But before long, the effects of the drug began to erode the social fabric, not only in China but in India too. A gradual increase in British imperial aggression against China eventually led to the first so-called Opium Wars in 1839 to 1842. The temporal alignment of the British decision to use gunboats against the Chinese in order to force them to accept opium, and then just 18 months later, the start of Indian indentureship in 1838, is perhaps one indication of how closely these systems are associated with each other. The disastrous opening of Chinese indentureship began some years later in Amoy, or Xiamen is the contemporary name, in 1852, as the reach of empire expanded eastwards, and then enabled by the expansion of the opium trade. On the ships that brought indentured labourers from India and China, fairly small amounts of opium, typically no more than £2, were included for medicinal use. We can look back at the inventories of supplies that were taken on board and find records of opium being included for use by the ship's surgeons. Opium would have been seen by the surgeons as particularly useful for dysentery, which was prevalent sometimes, but it would also have been key to pain relief. And I think it's important to note at this point that dysentery would have actually been brought on by the opium. So although they're giving them opium, opium would have actually stopped the dysentery, but the long-term effect of it would have actually brought it back. For some of the Indian indentured labourers, taking any kind of medicine from a European doctor would have been highly problematic, as this would have been seen as a pollutant and infringement on caste. In Theophilus Richmond's The First Crossing, for example, there is a patient who completely resists any medication, and on the ill-fated journey of Captain Swinton's Salsette, some migrants even refuse basic food for what appears to be adherence to caste restrictions. British authorities were not sensitive at all to either the requirements of caste or Chinese cultural idiosyncrasies. British agents on board the ships could not understand this kind of resistance. Conversely, many of the opium addicts that indentured themselves would have been seeking any sources of opium on board when their own stashes ran out. But rather than these small quantities that have a presence in the records, it is the larger shipments of hundreds of cases where opium itself is the cargo that interests me to a greater extent. Because of the clandestine nature of these shipments, the accounts and records of them seem to be much more elusive. Next slide. This map shows the area in red in which opium was grown in India, accurate to 1949. And I just want to make that point. It is, I mean, 1949. Okay, so well into the 20th century. The original map, produced by the United Nations, this is not their map, I'm going on to explain. The original map, produced by the United Nations, showing this area, was of poor quality. And so I have had the area transferred onto a new map and digitised. If such a map existed that represented growth, the growth of opium, before the turn of the 20th century, I believe this footprint would have been even bigger. Opium was grown on huge estates, as you can see, hundreds of thousands of hectares during the 19th century. Farmers would bring their crop to a central market station controlled by the East India Company, who would offer them a price to buy the raw material. Sometimes the prices would leave the farmers destitute. During the 19th century, the areas to the west, nearer to Bombay on this map, produced was then known at the time as Malwa opium. This is named after a district in the area. This opium would have made its way west to Bombay for shipping on to China. The British deemed this opium illegal as they had no control over its production and as such its huge profitability. But after a time, they managed to find a way of levying a tax, an exit tax, as it went through the port of Bombay. The British East India Company had a monopoly over the production of those fields further east. Here, the raw opium made its way to centralised processing plants to make it ready for shipping. One opium factory in particular, located at Patna, is at the heart of one of the states, that's Bihar, which is the ancestral homelands of many of the indentured labourers from the Caribbean. And indeed the growing fields beyond Patna are across huge swathes of Uttar Pradesh. So let me see if I can. Yeah, good. So the areas I'm thinking of, Bihar is kind of in this area. Are you seeing this? Yes, you are. Yeah, it's in this area. Uttar Pradesh goes up into these growing fields at the back. And as I say, I think those growing fields would have been much closer to Patna in the 19th century. Yeah, Uttar Pradesh. Okay, so what I want to do now is take a look at this Patna factory. Wrong way. Good. There's a fair amount of detail on the factory at Patna, as it was in the middle of the 19th century. We have a set of spectacular but chilling lithographs, the first of which is on screen now, made from the drawings by Walter Sherwell, who was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army. They take us through different rooms at the factory and allow us to see the scale of the operation. The scale of the operation. The raw opium is drained in a thick, sticky milk from the head of the plant and then processed. Opium was formed into dark mud-brown cakes and then packed into spherical clay containers, as you're seeing on here, which was rather like terracotta. The cakes were protected in the containers by poppy leaves and other leftovers from the process. The most important factor here in the shipping being that this stuff mustn't get wet. Okay, it has to stay dry. The spheres were packed into chests made from mango wood and shipped to Calcutta by way of the mighty Ganges, where the East India Company sold off the opium at auction to private traders and took no more responsibility for it. Private traders, therefore, had the much more perilous job of transporting an illicit and illegal product to China. So this is the whole fleet going up to the Ganges, going up to Calcutta. I now want to focus on opium in the Caribbean. Aside from its use on the ships, as I spoke about earlier, opium would have been available to indentured labourers after the arrival on the plantations. When reading the different voices in this field, such as Lisa Yun, Evelyn Hudahart, Wally Woodley and others, opinion varies on the function and the use of the narcotic. For those indentured labourers that were addicts, access to opium would have relieved the rigours of withdrawal, and it may have reduced any pain brought on by the work. It may have enabled some to continue working. For the planters and suppliers, this was useful for a number of reasons. In Cuba, the centre of Chinese indentureship in the Caribbean, there was effectively a market for opium that particularly targeted Chinese labourers, as Lisa Yun points out, and this is a quote. The selling of opium by labour management to coolies manifested a kind of racial wage, as opium use was pushed to Chinese labourers specifically, end quote. So in this view, opium is valorised for its function as a resource in the production of sugar, which had an intrinsic value as a product in itself. So in other words, opium's capital was thrown into the production of sugar through the indentured labourers. Evelyn Hudahart says that, and this is a quote, opium was the primary mechanism for social control on the plantations. In terms of the circulation of cash, this is a similar situation to those working on the cane fields who were rum drinkers. By which I mean, let's be clear, labourers buying opium would have enabled the traders and the wider system to take back some of the wages paid out to the labourers. It would have made it doubly hard for those addicted workers to accumulate cash and thus remove themselves from the terms of their contracts. This in a coupon system that proactively prevented any labourer from leaving. While the foregoing argument is referring to Chinese indentured labourers in Cuba, this is not to say that East Indians or Afro-Caribbeans were not targeted or involved in the supply elsewhere in the Caribbean. It seems as though the scale of the operation would have been much smaller outside of Cuba. Still, Wally Looklai points out that in British Guyana, those retail traders who were in non-sugar occupations were required to hold a licence. From these records, we know that by 1913, there were 23 licence holders who had a legal right to sell opium and ganja over the counter. That's incredible when you think about how small even Guyana is now. And there were 23 shops in 1930. A fitting comment from a Chinese immigrant, a Chinese indentured migrant in British Guyana regarding opium is recorded in John Jenkins' book, The Coolie, His Rights and Wrongs. So this is the quote. The wretched appearance of some of the votaries of this habit has more than once misled strangers into the conclusions unfair to the planters and the immigration systems. It appears, unhappily, that opium smoking is not altogether confined to the Chinese. A few Indians have picked up this habit from them. The mischief is perhaps beyond the reach of legislation, but such was not the opinion of a Chinaman, one of the cleverest met with in the colony, who allowed, when asked of why his fellow countrymen, who earned so much, had saved so little, and this is a quote from the Chinese migrant, that they spent a good deal on opium, but it was the English ship that brought it here. Seen from a different perspective, opium has another destructive and detrimental effect for not only the labourers themselves, of course, but also the economy of the colonies. Over a 15-year period in British Guyana, from 1865 to 1879, there appear to have been at least 29 cases of overdose. That's from the work of Brian Moore. According to the annual immigration report of Trinidad from 1863, quoted in Wally Looklai, most of the deaths of Chinese immigrants up until 1864 were, quote, indirectly attributable to dysenteric infections which were generally attended by the abuse of opium. These suicide cases of overdose, whether intentional or accidental, would have been huge losses for the friends and family of those involved. They would have also had a huge financial impact for the plantations, not only through the expenditure of transport for the labourers, but also through the withdrawal of the labour power of the migrant as a direct result of opium. Opium balanced the deficit of payments for the British during the 19th century. So much silver was pouring out of the British coffers into China for products like tea, silk, porcelain. With the opium being foisted upon the Chinese, that flow was effectively reversed. In this respect, John Bowring, British consul at Canton, and later the fourth governor and agitator for the Second Opium War, wrote to the Foreign Secretary, the Earl of Malmesbury, In the opening of the following sentence, he is referring to a shipment of Chinese indentured labourers from the port of Amoy. Associated with these questions, so the questions are the Chinese labourers, associated with these questions are the immense interests, both British and Anglo-Indian, involved in the opium trade, giving at the present moment more than 3 million sterling of revenue to India, and furnishing the means of payment for a large portion of the exports from China to Great Britain, her colonies, and the United States. Although they had differing experiences, tongue twister, the trafficking of Indians and Chinese was closely connected through European, particularly British, commercial interests that relied on India not only as a stopping point in the journey towards China, but also the fields of India were essential to the production of opium because the crop grew well there. The empire's shift to the east was fundamental to the fortunes of India, Great Britain, and as Bowring himself points out, for the same for the Caribbean and the United States. Indentureship ended in 1917, and although opium growth continued after that year, curiously enough, there was a distinct shift in attitudes towards the drug around this time. To some considerable extent, this was just lip service. In 1912, the International Opium Convention set up the regulation of trade and the trafficking between countries, which agreed, albeit in the case of Britain somewhat reluctantly, to restrict and control the drug. There's still a huge market which exists outside of local and international laws to this very day. 190,000 people a year across the globe overdose on drugs. The majority of these are as a result of opioids. The epidemic has shifted away from taking the drug, so that it's no longer a case of the epidemic being drug taking. The epidemic is now overdosing. Okay? There are so many directions and areas of analysis in which this paper could turn in the future, but the time allotted to me has allowed me to cover only what you've seen. All that I wanted to do is going to come in the future. So I'm determined to finish on time. I trust, however, that I have given you an appreciation of the central role played by the opium trade in sustaining indentureship and opium's use as capital in the mode of production of sugar. Thank you.
First of all, I want to express my appreciation to Dr. Maria Caladin, who gave me such a great opportunity to present my study here. I'm a Japanese scholar on Chinese modern history, and which means I'm always reading Chinese documents. And first of all, also I'm really sorry about my Japanese accent of my English, because maybe I'm the only one here who is not a native speaker of English, but I do my best. This time, I would like to talk about voices from the Chinese indentured laborers in Spanish colonies, and using the report of China's first official investigation in Cuba and Peru in the 1970s. But because of the time, this time I just want to talk about Peruvian case. So, this good-looking guy is called Yung Wing, and he is a late Qing reformer and educator, served in China's newly established diplomatic service in the 1870s. And he is a very well-known figure in the field of Chinese modern history as a westernized and modern figure, and as the first Chinese graduate of Yale University in the United States. Before being appointed to the Chinese Vice Minister to the United States, Spain, and Peru from 1875 to 1881, Yung Wing investigated the condition of Chinese in Peru in 1874. This was China's first official investigation of its overseas subject, and was carried out in tandem with the investigation in Spanish Cuba by Chen Lamping in the same year. So you can see Yung Wing is very different from traditional Chinese officials. The Chinese government investigation in Central and South America in 1874 were a milestone event and are significant for understanding China's diplomatic activities. The investigations in Peru and Cuba were implemented as a part of ongoing diplomatic negotiations in changing China. Then after Yung Wing and Chen Nanbing submitted the report of serious ill treatment of the Chinese in Peru and Spanish Cuba, the Chinese government successfully added special clauses that forbade the departures of any forced contract laborers from the port of Macau in its treaties with Peru and Spain. Since Macau has operated as the hub of the notorious Chinese coolie trade to Cuba and Peru, the treaties eventually led to a cut in the flow of Chinese indentured laborers to both areas. This study discusses that active communication between the Chinese indentured workers in Peru and the Chinese officials from the end of the 1860s to the 1870s, which indeed created the earliest transnational social space between them. Since the Chinese in Peru and Cuba, both countries having the Spanish colonial past, couldn't expect much help and protections from the respective governments of their residing countries. So Chinese indentured laborers and Chinese merchants there actively sought help from the Chinese authorities. This study mainly analyzes Chinese diplomatic papers in Taiwan and Beijing, and also little-known English writings by the Chinese officials and their collaborators during the investigation. Yung Wing accompanied two American friends on this investigation in Peru. One is Joseph Hopkins Twitchell, and he is in this picture, just beside Yung Wing, and showing how they are close friends. And he is a congregational clergyman. And the other one is not showing in this picture, but his name is Edward Kellogg. He is a medical doctor and Yung Wing's brother-in-law. During the Peru trip, Twitchell kept a diary journal which contains interview with Chinese in Peru, and Kellogg also describes the Peru investigation in detail in personal letters to his wife. Their personal writings also uncover how Yung Wing's mission carried out its investigation in Peru as well. In the late 1860s, the voices of Chinese indentured laborers in Latin America were brought to the Qing government, and this was the direct cause that made the government take a first step to protect overseas Chinese. By the end of December 1868, three Cantonese regional and ethnic benevolent associations in Lima co-authored two petitions and sent those to the American minister to Peru in Lima. The petitions elaborated on the condition of both Chinese laborers and Chinese merchants in Peru, and in particular focus on describing their sufferings and ill-treated living and working conditions. Quote, investors and plantation owners have absolute power, and the Chinese laborers are forced to work in the agricultural sector every day without enough rest, food, clothes, and payment, being tied up in chains and fetters, scolded and whipped. The Peruvian government connives plantation owners' ill treatment to the Chinese, and even rebuked the Chinese when the Chinese complained about the investors and owners. The end of quote. One of the features of the Chinese petition is its well-observed description on strong relationship between the investors or plantation owners and the Peruvian government. Meanwhile, the petitions do not contain any what concrete method the Chinese requested to the protected property. The American minister in Lima forwarded these petitions to the American minister in Beijing, and it was forwarded again to the Zhongli Yamen, the central organ for the foreign negotiation in China, in May 1869. 2 petitions were effective enough to induce a sequence of notices of Qing government to tackle the coal trade activities in Chinese territory. The Qing government banned the labor recruiting activities by all non-treaty countries. It's actually targeting Peruvian agents in Chinese territory. Through the communication with fragmented information, the voices from the Chinese in Peru pushed the Qing government to tackle the problem. This developed further in the diplomatic negotiations related to the conditions of the Chinese in Central and South America in the beginning of the 1870s. After diplomatic negotiations that were held in Tianjin, China, in October 1863, China entered into the Qing-Peru Commercial Treaty, a treaty with Peru on 26 June 1874. The ambassador of Peru was charged with successfully concluding the treaty with China. Peru was experienced a serious shortage of cheap labor, so the legal withdrawal of sufficient Chinese manual labor was an urgent need. However, the Chinese government was skeptical about the significance of the treaty for the Chinese. The Zhongli a new diplomatic organ established by the Qing government in 1862, also considered Peru as one of the countries engaging in the notorious Chinese courier trade through Macau. The anti-Peruvian policies of Chinese government caused several critical disputes in the negotiation, often causing them to break down. However, the Peruvian ambassador was able to get the British and American ministers and consuls in China to arbitrate to that the treaty negotiations were finally concluded in June 74. The Chinese government dispatched Yun Wing to Peru in the same year to investigate reports of severe treatment of the Chinese there. In order to delay or even cancel the ratification of the Qing-Peru Commercial Treaty, the Chinese government stalled by waiting for Yun Wing's report on the Chinese in Peru before exchanging it with Peru. In light of China's diplomatic background, Yun Wing's report contained information beneficial to the Chinese government and its effort to prevent the smooth ratification of the Qing-Peru Commercial Treaty. The Yun Wing report was written in Chinese and was not voluminous, but consisted of a number of different types of information. 1. Field report on Chinese laborers in the agriculture and construction sectors in Peru. 2. The testimonies of witnesses. 3. A petition from Chinese residents in Lima. 4. Interviews with the Chinese in Lima. And lastly, 5. 20 photos of Chinese coolies who had been tortured. Looking closely at Yun Wing's report, we can see 4 characteristics in the investigative method. First, a significant amount of the work was done by Americans who were residing in Peru. These American investigators were entrusted with surveys, and they concluded research on the outskirts of Lima, at mines in northern Peru, and coastal plantations. In particular, an American engineer who worked on sugarcane compressors and who had resided in Peru for 13 years visited a total of 17 Chinese camps. He reported low wages, overwork, whipping, and constant suffering from disease and malnutrition among the Chinese laborers. Another entrusted American investigator visited plantations, camps, and railroad building sites and reported on the heavy labor of the Chinese workers, such as digging at a site 3,000 meters above sea level, ill treatment, altitude sickness, and infectious diarrhea. Second, Yun Wing's report reflects the voices of the Chinese in Peru. The report includes a petition from the Cantonese Regional Association in Lima protesting the Macau coolie trade, and an interview record taken from the 14 Chinese merchants and workers in Lima, which illustrating each of their lives after leaving China. These show the Chinese people's working conditions and their patterns of settling in Peruvian society. The Chinese who landed in Peru were at first involved in one of 5 types of indentured labor. 1, mining. 2, railroad construction. 3, plantation work in cotton or sugarcane. 4, guano mine digging. And lastly, town laborers. After the expiration of their contract, they either engaged in manual labor or ran small businesses in cities like Lima. Those urban workers had communication problems with the Peruvians, but better conditions than the contract laborers. Third, the report contains the diplomatic advice which would be useful in the ensuring negotiations in China. And finally, the report contains Yung Win's analysis of Peruvian society. He criticized Peruvian society's instability, commenting, quote, "We cannot expect any fairness to resolve the Chinese problems here in Peru. Though called a democratic country, Peru adheres to the old Spanish customs in which rulers and subjects deceive each other. There is a widespread atmosphere of self-interest. The government is small in scale, and all kinds of tasks stagnant. Business managers here avoid hiring their native Indio laborers because of their higher labor cost. They consider the Chinese as being held in bondage and as cheap labor." So he is saying really badly about Peruvian society and Peruvian government. How was the investigation carried out in Peru? According to the English personal writings, those containing many information which doesn't show up in Chinese official papers, Yung Win and his 2 American companies landed on Callao on 1st September and left Peru on 12th September in 1874. This is a very short stay, less than 2 weeks. During this short stay, Yung Win had far more contact with the Chinese communities in Lima and Callao. On 1st September, the day of Yung Win's mission's landing, a Chinese merchant who was called out from the American vice consul came and talked with Yung Win, then took the mission to the Cantonese Regional Association in Lima for discussion and refreshment. Thereafter, Yung Win received almost daily visits from Chinese merchants and workers in Lima and Callao on the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, and 12th of September. So it's almost every day. The Chinese readers gave full cooperation finding witnesses and arranging interviews. To obtain full evidence of abusive treatment of the Chinese in Peru, Yung Win saw interviews as one of the methods to be used. The Twitcher journal contains 20 questions which were asked to the Chinese. Sorry, I'm going to just show these questionnaires here. During the investigation, the Chinese in Peru, the merchant in particular, often prepared welcoming tea, refreshment, and even blanket for Yung Win. Interestingly, Yung Win being educated at Yale University, thus being considered as a practical, liberal, and westernized intellectual, actually felt delighted by this Chinese-style hospitality. He even behaved as a traditional Chinese official, which made his 2 American friends really embarrassed. The relationship between Yunwing and the Chinese in Peru was similar to the relationship between merchant and officials emerging as a new social stratum seen in the local urban cities in China's southeast coastal area at the time, such as Shanghai, Canton, and Hong Kong. In these urban areas of southern China, the merchants who became the community leaders built a close relationship with the officials to secure their activities. Yunwing and the Chinese in Peru, their close communications were the reproduction of the traditional merchant-official relationship of homeland China. This was the moment of forming the earliest transnational social space between the Chinese overseas and the Chinese officials from the Qing dynasty. Within this space, the Chinese in Peru expressed their true thought and opinion. And this is a very interesting account in the English diary of Creagim and Twitcher. It is saying, at the Chinese dinner, they gave us account of their professions of the Catholic faith in order to become citizens in Peru. All spouted with laughter the idea that it signified anything moral to them. Laughed as they told how they went to confession and communion. So maybe they are saying very badly about how they were doing confession and communion. Meanwhile, the field research in Peru must have depended largely on the Americans residing there. There were no one in the mission who could speak Spanish. As Kellogg wrote, quote, "We have to pantomime for almost everything that we want at the hotel and elsewhere. Until yesterday, since we left New York, we have been unable to procure a simple copy of the newspaper which we could read." End of quote. The need for cooperation from outside was indispensable and urgent. Kellogg's creativity and Twitcher's Yale University connections solved this problem and enabled them to carry out the investigation successfully. They were able to find reliable Americans in Peru to whom they could delegate the field investigation. Kellogg, in particular, was the one who tracked down these key persons. To sum up, Yunwing did not always supply the initiative throughout the investigation. Even the ad hoc measures applied by Twitcher and Kellogg on the spot were effective. So as a concluding remarks, the occupational help, information, and active cooperation from various sectors in Peru, such as the American specialists, the U.S. consulate, the Chinese associations, Chinese merchant, and the Chinese indentured laborers, all contributed to the success of the Yunwing mission. There were the factors which gave credibility to and strengthened the Yunwing report. The investigation disclosed the sufferings in the life of the Chinese in Peru, but during the investigation, the Chinese emphasized their bitterness about the Peruvian society. However, when they had intimate conversations in the context of the Chinese merchant-official relationship, they spoke out their true feelings. This was the reinforcement of the imperial official subject relationship outside China. Later, the Yunwing report led to controversy in the negotiations from July to August 1875. The Chinese government used the Yunwing report to reject ratification of the treaty. Even though China and Peru finally ratified the treaty on 7th August 1875, the fact of the ill treatment of the Chinese in Peru led the Chinese government send a memorial to the emperor asking for stricter enforcement of the regulations of the coolie trade. Thank you so much.
Hi everyone. I'm really excited to be here, and I just flew in this morning. If I'm a little bit frazzled. Please bear with me. And thank you so much to Maria Caladine. Oh, there you go. Hi. for inviting me to give this paper. I've been looking forward to this for most of the year, so thanks so much. So I am in a law department, and it's not very common that we get to venture outside of doctrinal research to do legal history, but this, I think, officially is conceived as a legal history project, but really, full disclosure, began as a family history project about 15 years ago when my grandpa, literally passing away, and I think that's relevant to his the way that he approached his identity, started gathering the grandchildren around because his own children didn't really want to confront being Indian. It's another footnote that I'll discuss. And said, oh, you have to learn Hindi immediately. This has to happen. He only spoke a little bit of Hindi and didn't really know much about India, really. But this was something that was important to him and really only became pressing when he was facing death. And I think that's not unusual for people in his position. So his position was someone who had been born in Jamaica. He's of Indian origin, born in Jamaica, moved to the United States when he was an adult, and he and his wife, who he met in Jamaica, but they married in the United States, then had kids. And those kids were my parents. So you know, I'm a few generations removed from even the types of you know, formations of identity that I would have had as an Indo-Jamaican. So as an American of Indo-Jamaican heritage, it's there are quite a lot of layers there, and layers to get through in your own family. So these things kind of came to me later in life as points of interest, but then immediately became very interesting for research for me as well. So that partially answers the question, why am I focusing on Jamaica? Other parts of the answer to that question are the fact that most of the research that I've been coming across, most writing and most of the literature also, is coming out of Guyana and Trinidad as far as the Caribbean go. And there are some writers who really focus on Indenture in Jamaica, some historians like Doreen Shepherd, who's written quite comprehensively about Indenture, and and people of Indian descent living in Jamaica up until the 1950s and 60s. She's written about women, Indo-Jamaican and of Indo and African descent in Jamaica, but there hasn't been the litany of work on Jamaica. And I think that while Doreen Shepherd's work is extremely comprehensive in certain ways, the stories that I'm interested in telling, I think, require a lot more digging in detail, and that's part of the reason that I'm all over the place in terms of methodology. So that's, I think, where this paper will kind of end up, is talking about the methodology. A few points on indenture, the experience, I guess, of indentureship in Jamaica. They don't really set it aside in huge ways from Trinidad, let's say, but there are some things to note. So there were 37,000 people of Indian descent who were indentured to Jamaica versus 150,000+ in Trinidad, which which some historians argue has shaped the way that that the experience of being of Indian descent in Jamaica has panned out in relation to other places in the Caribbean. But then, Shepherd and others also argue that it was patterns of social life that shaped that. So the way that people lived on plantations, the way that people did or didn't integrate into communities, intermarriage playing a significant role in Jamaica, quite a different one. But also the idea that you're Jamaican first, and this is also something that that links back to the story of those who, in third and fourth generation, who find it almost embarrassing to discuss being of Indian descent. So my grandfather, his community was, African descent, Indian descent, all kinds of Jamaicans, and they considered themselves Jamaican first. But then if you really probe deeply, you get to you try to act, you know, as a little kid, playing these games, forcing my grandfather to say, "Where are you really from?" You know, it's a painful thing for them to deal with, because then you have to confront these. I think someone mentioned in the previous panel these kind of rivalries. I think it was Gabrielle mentioned these like rivalries between Africans and Indians, and in Jamaica that played out in a very colonial way. You know, so there was. Shepard points out that there wasn't officially segregated schooling, but there were schools set up with the understanding that Indian parents wouldn't want to send their children to these schools, partly because of the fear of intermixing along race lines, but caste lines as well, and seeing the colonial administration as a project of de-Indianization, and for those reasons not trusting the school systems that were set up particularly to cater for young Indian children, late 1800s into the early 1900s. So it's an interesting area to look at. Jamaica is in the context of the Caribbean. What I've been interested in as, I guess, first and foremost a legal historian, but then really as maybe a storyteller is how I would consider myself in my private space, you know, and not in my workspace, is the richness that can come out of telling stories about plantations. So my grandfather and his parents and his parents' parents were on the same plantation. So it was about 35 years of the same plantation in Jamaica. And lots of families are like that, and particularly families who then went to Kingston, you know, in 1920s. If they had been there for 3 or 4 generations, they'd only known that plantation, and they had a very close-knit community within that plantation, then went to the big city, and then lots of Jamaicans emigrated from Kingston after that. And so the richness of those stories, I find, is missing largely from the comprehensive histories that have been written on Jamaica and the indenture experience. And I also think that it's difficult to access those stories without using imaginative and creative methods. So that's where I think I break with a lot of legal history and really start to irritate my colleagues, promising to write fiction instead of writing law. Some of the I think the inspirations that I get for using fiction, well, I haven't used it yet, but looking toward fiction for the type of richness that I hope will come out of a project like mine is Saidiya Hartman and Lose Your Mother. She wrote about going to Ghana as, you know, as someone who's 5-6 generations removed from Africa, but recognizing that the Middle Passage it plays a very central part in the way that she conceives of herself as a Black American. And similarly, Gayitra Bahadur, who wrote Coolie Woman, who talks in a very similar way about discovering, but not discovering something new, but really going through the process of reckoning with what's already there, kind of waiting for her. And that links to, I think, the literary aspects in Beloved that have been theorized very heavily from Toni Morrison, which is her, the subtle haunting. It's not so subtle in Beloved because the daughter comes back and is there and she's a ghost. But the idea that there's a history waiting in the spaces and in the imagination that can be very, very real and palpable. And there's in American studies, there's also this budding idea of hapticality and being able to touch what's not physically there, but is there for all other intents and purposes. And I think that is very present, at least as a historian, going into these archives and reading the details about people that you literally dream about, or have heard about and have heard stories about similar, I guess we'll call them ancestors in some way. It's very real. So engaging with these concepts for me has been important in archival research, in addition to the way that I think I'm going to end up theorizing this work. So speaking of the archives, the material that I am encountering in the first kind of round of research, and the first round has been the last 3 years going to various archives, has been daunting, and it's also been a bit disappointing, partly because I, just lay all my cards out there, I feel like the UK needs to take more responsibility for materially upkeeping these colonial records. And it's partly because the colonial records, some of them exist at the British Library and some at the National Archives at Kew Gardens here, but a lot of the records that are relevant to these stories are all over the world because people migrate. So I went to the Jamaican National Archives to look at ship records and to look at actual indenture documents, indenture documents, which have a lot of material about people, the village, and then the small locality within the village, father's name, caste or religion, next of kin, all of this information. And then on the back in English, Hindi, and Urdu, there is the actual contract. But there are thousands of these in Jamaican archives. Only about 40% are accessible because they're in very bad condition. And most of them are not being digitized very quickly. And it's not because of, I think it's a combination of lack of money, but also lack of structural resources. So even a grant and just giving money to the National Archives, I don't think will speed the process. But I think the material issues around the archives are something that need to be dealt with very quickly. But so at Jamaican National Archives, you get a lot of detail about people. And this is important if a project like this were to be able to actually access some of the detail that I think would provide a lot of insight on how people lived on plantations, so how communities formed, where people came from, and how people were distributed within Jamaica to these relatively few plantations. And then I recently went to the State Archives of West Bengal in Calcutta, which have a different layer of information. So the information there has to do with investigations that were carried out because things were going wrong. So if contractors who were approaching people who were going to be indentured, basically, who were going to be conscribed to this type of labor, acted in a way that was outside of the rules, the preset rules they'd investigated. But then you find other details about people who returned. You find details about how the different colonial offices tried to resolve problems as they came up, novel problems that probably are foreseeable, obviously. So large numbers of deaths on a certain ship. How do you resolve that? Being that there's a colonial office in Calcutta where people are emigrating from, so the emigration office, the protector of immigrants in different colonies, so one in Jamaica, so they'd be corresponding, and then things would be escalated up to London. So all of these administrative bodies were communicating all of the time, and that caused a lot of, there's a lot of paperwork, but it's also part of a collective story, and it's difficult to get it all together. But I think that's a material need that I think historians have, and it's, there are finite resources that are going to decay and fall apart. Just to touch on this imagination thing, I won't go through all of these slides actually, because some of them are, this is just going to take too much time. I tend to read the literature that I'm encountering on indenture alongside of literature from the Middle Passage, which is very dangerous in lots of ways to historically conflate the two ideas. But I've come across writings that approached the concept of the Kalapani that are very resonant with, I think, more new scholarship, or scholarship that's come out in the last couple of years on how historians, particularly Black feminist historians, approach legacies of slavery, not just the Middle Passage, but in general, the conditions of post-slavery life. So Christina Sharp's concept of the wake, and doing work based around being in the wake of a ship, being in the wake of the recoil of a gun, this way of conceiving being in a space of violence that's both past and present, and arguably future, helps me to think about the possibilities of doing research where we're not really beyond this moment of indenture. We're still in the present trying to construct what it is and how it's, how it's left marks materially and also psychically on societies. But then reflecting on what we're doing as historians when we're doing that work and how we're engaging with that work and how it changes us. So, right, so I'm all over the place methodologically, and I think that shows it a bit. But this is kind of part of this process of thinking it through. A couple of just points before I finish that have come out of the research that I think tie in together how I hope to use literature and kind of this theorizing historicity are things like the namesake. So looking through these hundreds and hundreds of names on registers and looking for names that look like the ones I'm looking for. So looking for names that resemble the ones on the plantations that I've come across, because I can't find precisely where the people on the plantations have come from. So what do you do then? You kind of look for similarities. And I was in Gayatri Bahadur's book, she's working with the birth certificate of, I think, her great-grandma, but also at some points follows the stories of namesakes. And I think that's something that is historically valuable, even though it's not what you're looking for. It tells a different story and it's worthwhile tracing that. I had a few of those experiences, partly because I don't know if Caribbeans in the room would agree, but I find that Bacchus is a very common, if not common, it's a name that comes up quite a lot. So there are cricket players named Bacchus, there are stores called Bacchus. And sometimes they're spelled like the Greek god of wine, sometimes they're spelled B-A-C-C-A-S, B-A-C-C-U-S. And there are various theories about what this name is and how it's developed. But one of them is that it's kind of a transcription, kind of uncareful transcription of the name Bux, which was transcribed in the late 1800s as B-U-X, and is a typical it's a Muslim last name, and it wasn't necessarily only in the regions of Bihar and UP, but it came up quite a lot in the records that I was also looking at from the time. But it's interesting because it's not a very prevalent name generally, so it's an interesting name to trace. And that was the kind of first step in my family research, was figuring out, where this name Bruce come from. It's very not Indian, and it's obviously, so there was a myth that we had Scottish roots that makes absolutely no sense given what we already knew about our family. And it turns out, in Jamaica, the Scottish Presbyterian mission was extremely strong, and they converted lots and lots of people to Christianity. But to convert, you needed to choose a name, and Bruce was the name that my great-grandfather chose, and his name was actually Ali Bacchus. And he didn't tell the children really why they were named Bruce, and so they didn't really even know. And then they grew up, as adults in the U.S., so it was a difficult thing to have to unpack, but, British record keeping, went back and found the deed poll and the newspaper clipping where you had to make the announcement about the name change. But it was interesting because, he was clearly from a Muslim family and was a planter, and then the next generation, his father was a planter, and the next generation he became a pastor actually, a Christian pastor named Sam Bruce, and moved to Florida and started a completely new life, even from the one he knew outside of Kingston. So there are a lot of layers to the story, but it's a very colonial story, and part of the research, I think, engages with what it means to do history today, using, going through and relying on institutions that are at their core colonial institutions, whether they're record-keeping institutions or, a little controversial, but church institutions in some ways are colonial without making that a judgment. It is an institution that was present and doing the missionary work that has shaped the identities and the lives of lots of people. So there's lots more, but I hope to meet and speak with people later today. I'm sorry I missed yesterday, I was at a funeral, but I'm really excited to be here, and I hope I get to touch base with you soon.
Yes, so thank you very much. I'm also very happy to be here and very excited. And I'm actually currently gathering some new ethnographic data for a project that explores the kind of shifting and contested memorializations of the legacy of Indian indentured labor in the Netherlands, but also in Suriname. And today I want to explore some of this preliminary data I've gathered around an action committee that's known as Tetteri Must Rise. It's a transnational effort to topple the bust of the colonial officer in charge of Indian migration, Barnetlian, and replace his statue with one of a young Indian indentured labor woman named Janie Tetteri, who was a vital part of an uprising on the Zorgenhout plantation in 1884. And this bust is in Paramaribo, in Suriname. Now, at the time that I wrote the abstract for this conference, actually, the movement was picking up steam in the Netherlands and in Suriname, but not even the committee members could have anticipated that this past September 24th, which is the anniversary of the uprising on Zorgenhout, that the statue of Janie Tetteri would actually be unveiled, minutes away from the Surinamese presidential residence and Independence Square. And I've recently returned from Suriname, where I had the opportunity to attend the official unveiling. So I'd like to today also frame my presentation around this moment of unveiling, and I hope you will indulge me in that because it will take us away from just this context of the Netherlands, but also bring in Suriname, so it'll be a little bit more transnational, but I think exciting because it's new. Now, conceptually, I sort of locate my analysis across various theories of affect that are popular in anthropological and colonial historical work. And my use of the term aesthetic, very briefly, kind of follows Birgit Meyer and other anthropologists who want to explore the multisensorial affective experiences and dimensions of life, rather than talking about maybe a disinterested view on beauty and art, right? And I focus mainly today on a critical connection between the work of Marianne Hirsch on post-memory in conversation with Carl Torbeli's discussion of, quote, coolie heritage-making processes. I think post-memory offers us a lens by which to view the deeply affective ties to indentured labor history that are possible in a transgenerational and sort of transfamilial context. Yet Torbeli reminds us and brings us back to the fact that this ongoing struggle to reclaim the ruptures and silences and the histories of indentureship require us to go beyond passive transmission of historical trauma, to include newly emerging ways to articulate and also to connect to these traumas. And I argue today that Tetteri, as a freedom fighter and a hero, is one of these newly emerging ways that the experience of indentured labor in Suriname and Netherlands is sort of beginning to be felt in the bones of the community. So to explore this idea further, I just want to go over 3 domains where this is present. So first of all, the aesthetic and discursive elements. So the memorial landscape of Indian indentured labor in Suriname, I think, is very important in order to locate Tetteri's statue. Second is the aesthetics of Tetteri on film and how it's been narrated through the academic studies of her that have emerged since around 2011. And the third is the unveiling ceremony itself in Paramaribo as an effective participatory moment of nationalist and decolonial framing. Okay, so let's look at some of these statues. So, social actors within the Indo-Surinamese community in Netherlands and in Suriname are actively working to displace the idea of sort of the docile, hard-working, well-integrated model minority by introducing new heroes and historical figures into collective historical and cultural memory. they have also begun to sharply critique the oppressive and coercive nature of the indentured labor system. And within communities, such discussions, they often become heated, they become personal, and each side is sort of pushing to make their narratives part of a wider public discussion of indenture and indentured identity. So these ideas do not come without contestation, always. Now, the monumental landscape to indentured labor in Suriname is one such terrain where these contestations are being waged. Most monuments that I have observed, they celebrate passivity, particularly when memorializing people. For those familiar with the history of Suriname, the most famous, quote, couple of indentured labor are Baba and Mai, you see in this picture. And they're sort of an older couple who are said to be the first British Indians to set foot on Surinamese soil. Their story and presence is actually quite ubiquitous around the country, with a square dedicated to them close to the official kind of Independence Square and government offices in Paramaribo, which is here, but also there's a square dedicated to them at the large market in Nikeri district as well. So here you see them again. So they're always depicted side by side. So they're really depicted as a couple. They seem somewhat vulnerable. You can look here better, you can see their faces. And they always have this kind of serene sort of smile, a sort of sense of resignation to their faith, that they're ready to begin their new lives in Suriname. Okay. Now, let's go here. Oh, you can't really see his face, I'm sorry. But this is also something that I noticed at a market in Kwata, which is a locality that falls within the districts of Paramaribo and Vanica. It's just this kind of lone statue of an Indian laborer. There's not anything else written about it, but again, you see very much it's a monument to labor, it's a monument to sort of passivity and accepting the fate of working in Suriname. And this is also in a district where there is a high concentration of Indo-Surinamese people. But alongside workers themselves, there are more abstract symbols to memorialize indentured labor. The ship, particularly the first ship, the Lala Rook, has a crucial place in the monumental landscape. And this is in a small town called Groningen, where a monument to this ship has been erected. And I really resist aligning this with rich analyses that many scholars, such as Culturally and others, have made of the ship, and by extension of the sea itself, as a space of transformation, a space of hybridity and meaningful interaction. I see this symbol of the ship in the memorial and the material landscape of Surinamese nationhood as sort of strategically functioning as what might be called a non-place, a place where the laborer cannot make these creative relationships and sort of exists and survives in anonymity. In this way, the ship is rather a memorialization of the moment of arrival. The first and original moment of meaning-making and identity is arrival in Suriname, when they move from being this anonymous laborer to being an integral part of the Surinamese landscape through the work that they do. So now let's look at Teteri in contrast. Teteri is a monument to uprising and defiance, and she marks an aesthetic shift from this anonymous laborer to an active freedom fighter. You can see here her hands are raised, her eyes are fixed, and she's fixed on a target in front of her. And then look a little bit more clearly at her face here for a moment. Now, this aesthetics of activeness is tied very much to her narrative as a freedom fighter in popular media and academic writing. She's inscribed as a multi-layered hero whose fluid and unconventional attitudes towards gender and religion make her the ideal figure around whom to remember the traumatic experiences of indentured labor migration in contemporary times. So the most significant historical study of her life was carried out by a historian named Rajinder Bahanbali in 2011. The historical analysis was also the basis for a two-part, highly dramatized documentary of Teteri's life, produced and aired by the Organization for Hindu Media in the Netherlands. And it was also shown in various film screenings around Suriname and the Netherlands. And the film was seen as a strategy to mobilize awareness for her story and to mobilize support to actually topple the statue of Barnett Leon. Now, the film is a highly dramatized participatory performance. Oh, and I have to apologize, the film clips were not working today, but I can give you links to them later. where lines between actors, audiences, and historical figures are consciously blurred. So the documentary centers around Teteri's suffering, mostly. A single woman on a quest to survive. She left Patna district from India on her own as a single mother to Suriname. From her time on the boat, she is presented as a caring individual who makes lasting relationships, as people feel compelled to confide in her. She herself doesn't pass judgment on those around her and even helps to educate men around her in ways to better respect their wives on the plantation. Teteri is also always identified as a Muslim. However, her faith is not a moment of division. It in fact facilitates her kind spirit and her understanding. She even adopts a Hindu baby, born to a woman who committed suicide. As a woman was rumored to be a prostitute, no one else was willing to take her in. And Teteri adopting this Hindu baby is a strongly cited example among my respondents of how she transcends taboos and boundaries and sets an example for unity within the Indo-Surinamese community today. And the film consciously made use of relatively young community members in Suriname who had no acting experience. And during an interview with a woman who was chosen to play Teteri, who I'll call Naya today, I was told that this was done purposely to sort of let the, quote, personalities of people come through during the filming. And before the documentary was made, none of the actors were actually familiar with Teteri's stories. And over the course of the filming, they became familiar with the history. And Maya told me, quote, the whole thing was very emotional, deeply emotional. It's like, we knew what our ancestors had done. We read about it in history class, but it didn't live in us. The feeling wasn't there until we made the film. For most of us in the film, the breaking point was when Teteri's friend confesses that she has to prostitute herself to care for her child. At that point, we had to stop filming because we, the actors, were crying. That's when we realized the kinds of things our ancestors did for us to live the way we do now. For me, especially because Teteri is a woman, she was a single mother, I asked people to put themselves in her shoes. It would be difficult even today to endure what she did. When I even talk about the film, I get really emotional. I rewatch it a lot. When we showed the film during a screening, my little brothers burst out into tears when Teteri was shot because they said it was like I was being shot. And I know Teteri is a Muslim. Our family ties are different. I'm a Hindu. But yes, she is still my ancestor. And also, Maya went on to tell me that after she made the film, her nickname has become Teteri, so people refer to her as Teteri. Now, during another group viewing in Southeast Amsterdam that I attended, a man named Mr. Kumar became so angry that he had to leave the room. Before he left, he articulated that, quote, this statue is the only form of reparations that we have, and expressed his anger at the reluctance of some community members to sort of not support the campaign to establish this statue of Teteri. Now, obviously, Maya and Mr. Kumar are very differently involved in the film technically, but their emotional responses really paints a picture of the ways that this dramatization has really served to connect many community members in Suriname and the Netherlands to Teteri's struggle, and has really boosted up the Teteri Must Rise movement. So, after much transnational lobbying, after all these film screenings, on September 24th, Teteri was unveiled. She came to life in Paramaribo. The actual installation of Teteri was rumored to have taken place in the middle of the night. Her statue was covered with a white sheet as people arrived at the corner of these two streets in the center of Paramaribo. And on the street, you see this tent that had been set up for the ceremony, decorated in the Surinamese colors of yellow, green, and red. The atmosphere was very somber. Under a graying evening sky, the audience was asked to stand to sing the Surinamese national anthem, and then take a minute's silence to mark the sacrifice that their ancestors had made. Now, this somber atmosphere, the minutes of silence, the emphasis on memorializing and never forgetting the sacrifices that Teteri and others made, may be what Marianne Hirsch calls the work of this transmitting intergenerational traumatic knowledge and experiencing such trauma despite generational remove. But at the same time, the unveiling signaled much more than just this kind of transmission across generations, as new narratives of traumatic histories, particularly the story of Tetteri were being collectively experienced for the first time, not only publicly, but also officially. In attendance at this event were prominent members of the government, including the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Indian ambassador. The guest of honor was the Vice President of Suriname, Ashlyn Adin, who you see here behind Tetteri under her kind of white veil. And honorable mentions were, of course, given to President Desi Bouterse and members from Dutch delegations. And the evening carried on with a series of short speeches by these people. And each speech inscribed Tetteri's role as a national figure, a Surinamese figure of anti-colonial resistance. And each speaker took time to acknowledge that she's not just an example for an Indo-Surinamese community, but for the whole of Suriname. Tetteri, as a freedom fighter and a resistor, was woven deftly into the history of Suriname as well as the world. The vice president began his speech by saying that by attending the ceremony, we were all, quote, shareholders in the fight for decolonization around the world, and quoted Bob Marley and the quest to emancipate yourself from inner and mental slavery. He mentions the struggles to topple statues of Columbus in South America, the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, and recent topplings of Confederate statues in the US as part of the same movement that Tetteri's statue represents. But it was very clear to say that, fortunately, Tetteri was established by peaceful means in Suriname. He went on to say that this is also a moment wherein you can recognize the underrepresentation of female freedom fighters, and hope this statue would be an example to women in Suriname in the struggle against the aftermath of colonialism. A speech from the representative from the Netherlands, who was heavily involved in the movement, also focused on the decolonial national significance that the statue has for contemporary Suriname. Tetteri was called a sign of the unity and diversity that exists in the face of colonial oppression. Now, discourses of decoloniality have been very central to the movement, Tetteri Must Rise, and these discourses circulate transnationally between Suriname and the Netherlands, which brings with them ever-changing kind of contexts and meanings. So in Suriname, the decolonial framework, it's really been significant in post-independent nation-building processes, and it often operates in tandem with this idea of unity and diversity narrative, where various ethnic groups, Wilkins groups, have risen above colonial oppression to come together as Surinamers and live peacefully. However, the nationalist discourse emphasizes the separateness but equalness of these groups, and ignores the realities of hybridization and contact across these groups. And I contend that the decolonial should not be read separately from the national here, if we are to understand the complicitness of today's political Surinamese landscape in the establishment of this statue. Now, on the other hand, in the Netherlands, she was instead framed as an Indo-Caribbean historical figure, and the idea of national Surinamese unity was markedly absent from a lot of the discussions around her. Decoloniality in the Dutch context is seen as a very kind of controversial, radical stance, but for those who support it, it's a necessary process of self-education and betterment. It's a way of governing oneself according to self-respect. If you have self-respect, you will understand that Tetteri was a freedom fighter who wanted to move beyond oppression of the white man. Right? It's important to mention that both of these frameworks are part of the way that Tetteri becomes legitimate, but I do realize they need much more unpacking. There's a lot more there from the decolonial framework. So at the end of the unveiling, when the speeches were over, we were ushered outside to the monument where the official unveiling took place actually by Vice President Adin. He removed the white sheet from Tetteri's body, and a flurry of cameras really went off in a fury. And as an official closing, a woman was asked, a woman was asked to perform Afro-Surinamese Vinti rituals at the feet of the statue, dropping flowers and spreading water on the statue, while singing the well-known national folk song, Mama Shwana, Mother Suriname. As an emotional finish, she grabbed Tetteri's hand and thanked her for her sacrifice. The flurry of cameras continued. The vice president and other prominent politicians embraced and smiled for cameras, and community members scrambled to come and take their own photos with Tetteri for the first time. This is a blurry picture of some very prominent people, including Ashkenaden, around the unveiling. And then people taking pictures. This is people from Suriname House in the Netherlands. Very excited about this unveiling. Sorry, I'm bad at this. In lieu of a conclusion, I think there are points to consider, because this is all very new data. I think this is a sort of move from passive to active when we look at the monumental landscape of Indian indentured labor and Tetteri statue. And it's very important to realize and acknowledge the shifts. But we need to ask ourselves, will more shifts follow? Is this a precedent-setting statute? Will this be a game changer? And a lot of people that I've talked to also have anxiety around the momentum of the movement. They wonder now that Tetteri has been put in instead of Barnett Leon, will people lose interest in Tetteri? And on the other hand, people who are very busy working on her history think that, will she just be this token Indian woman that's put on the landscape? What about all of the other women who are also involved in freedom fighting movements from indentured labor backgrounds? So there's a lot of anxiety to keep the interest going, to keep the research going, and to keep these kinds of actions going. One thing that was conspicuously absent from my presentation, what happened to Barnett Leon? Where did he go? So it's very important also to note that his removal was done very unceremoniously, a week before Tetteri was established. And the public didn't know about this. I certainly didn't know about this. And the people that were there were just a few key members who were involved in the Tetteri Must Rise movement from the Netherlands. And it was, a video of it was put on Facebook, it was live streamed, but that was not the event. The event was putting Tetteri up. So I think we can unpack the layers of nationalism and decolonialism very critically if we look to the way that presence of a statue versus removal and absence of a statue is part of the decolonial framework, right? And Barnett Leon, it's still very unclear where he will go. Some people say he will go to Fort Zeelandia to join Queen Wilhelmina. There's a bust of Queen Wilhelmina that was removed during independence that was put there, and they're going to make kind of a colonial monument museum. But other people say there is very little money to do that, so as far as I know, he's somewhere floating around Paramaribo. Thank you very much.